Well, looks like it's time to get started. Thank everybody for coming out tonight. As you've hopefully been watching, we do have a program here every Thursday night. Next week is Valentine's Day, and we're going to take a romantic look at the book Tough Trip Through Paradise, which I don't think most people think of as a romance, but that's part of it, and we're going to learn more about it. Tonight, I'm really happy to have with us Christy Goll. She is an assistant editor here at the Montana Historical Society in our publications program. She's been here 5 years, which is kind of hard to believe. She's a graduate of Carroll College. She grew up in the far distant city of Clancy. So she's a Helena native, fourth generation Montanan. Her grandparents homesteaded near Turner. And she's been a really great addition to the staff here in all ways. And I know that this is going to be a good program. She did it for the history conference that we had here in Helena last year, and I didn't get to hear it because I was busy working, but it was a highly recommended program. So I want Christy to know that the pressure is on, and that she better live up to her reputation. So anyway, Christy, go.
I'm going to tell you the story of Mary Frances Benton Connor, or Fanny as her friends called her. She was a woman who defied expectation. Like so many women in the early 1900s, she came to Montana, claimed a homestead, and taught school to pay the bills. But unlike most homesteaders, she moved here at the relatively old age of 59. And while most women homesteaders and teachers were single, Fanny was married. Like many other homestead women, she documented her experiences in a diary, but even that diary is unlike any other because she wrote it entirely in verse. As we look closely at Fanny's 1921 diary, I hope that it will serve as a window into the homesteading experience. Fanny's poems record the joys and trials of teaching in a rural school, the struggles of homesteaders who sent their children there, the difficulty of isolation, and the beauties of the Montana prairie. In her diary, she tells the little details of everyday life, like the ruined taste of cow's milk in springtime when the wild onions bloomed. She also documents the greater tragedies of the homestead movement, like the families who, driven to poverty, at last washed out. Fanny was born on February 13, 1864, in Adams County, Illinois. Her father, Minutes Benton, had immigrated to the United States from Germany in 1857 and settled in La Prairie, Illinois. He worked there as a farmhand, and that's where he met Fanny's mother, Angeline Harmon Benton, who worked on the neighboring farm. They married in 1861. In 1863, they moved to Champaign, Illinois, where they had 2 sons and 2 daughters, including Fanny in 1864. The family later moved to a farm near Quincy, Illinois, and again in 1870 to a farm south of Cahokia, Missouri, where they had 4 more children. At the age of 16, with an 8th grade education, Fanny began teaching in a little subscription school in Missouri. Subscription schools sprang up in the absence of public schools. The settlers would see the need for a school and get together and hire a teacher, and they would each pay a little fee or subscription for her salary. A year later, in 1880, Fanny moved to Iowa to teach. She lived with an aunt, returning to her parents' home in Missouri for her vacations. It's not known just when or where she met John Connor, a farmer and trader from Nebraska. We do know that she spent her last summer vacation at home preparing her wedding outfit, but Fanny was torn. She wanted so badly to go to college that she once decided to break the engagement, but John persuaded her to reconsider, and on September 30th, 1883, they married at Fanny's parents' home. That fall, they moved to John's farm in Nebraska, 5 miles southeast of the town of Waterbury. And there, John raised livestock while Fanny raised 9 children. 2 other daughters died at birth. In 1895, the family moved into the town of Waterbury and bought a grocery store. And this was the first in a series of moves for them. In 1905, they moved by covered wagon to a farm in Minnesota's Red River Valley, and then back to Waterbury in 1909 with the 5 children who were still at home. By 1913, John and Fanny's children were grown and married, most of them anyway, and at the ages of 60 and 49, John and Fanny might have seemed too old to move again. But that year, John boarded a railroad immigrant car with his sons Floyd and Robert and moved to Inverness, Montana. And they claimed adjoining homesteads right on the U.S.-Canadian border about 35 miles north of Rudyard. Robert's family followed soon after that. And then Fanny and her youngest daughter, Ruby, stayed behind in Nebraska to sell the house and so that Ruby could attend the normal school near Wayne and get a teaching certificate. In the spring of 1917, Fanny and Ruby traveled to Montana and joined John on the homestead, and then Ruby moved to Butte to go to college to become a nurse. But by 1920, Fanny had moved away from John too. But her reasons for moving were decidedly different from Ruby's. In her diary, she confessed that she had chosen her husband blindly, writing, "I thought that love would guide me true." As she put it in a letter to her daughter Ella, "I was like one in a foundering ship and left it and pulled for the shore where the firm ground was beneath me and I could travel on life's journey on my own way." Fanny's own way involved claiming a homestead and teaching school in order to provide for herself. So in 1920, Fanny went to the Great Falls Land Office and filed her claim on 400 acres on the Milk River. She was 56 at the time. Now, under homesteading law, married women could not claim land. The Stock Raising Homestead Act, under which Fanny filed, allowed 640 acres of non-irrigable land per household head. But Fanny would not have been considered a household head because she was married at the time. She never divorced John. There was a loophole in the law, however. The law considered a woman to be a head of household if her husband was a confirmed drunkard, if he deserted the family, or if he became incapacitated. Now, John was never incapacitated, and whatever else his faults, he was not a drunkard. So Fanny must have used her status as separated from him to convince the authorities that she was indeed the head of household. In fact, she had long harbored bitterness toward him for the way that he had provided for the family. We get a glimpse of it in family letters. In 1916, as she was considering moving from Nebraska to Montana, she wrote to her son George, "I expect to go to Montana in the spring. I would have money enough for myself if your pa would help Ruby as he ought." So Fanny, it was the fall of 1920, and she started teaching at Swift School. That's about 5 miles from the town of Goldstone, which is pretty much no more. I think there's still a store there. It's north of Rudyard. And it was about 10 miles away from her husband's homestead. At the time, school boards often would refuse to hire married women. In fact, a lot of single female teachers had a contract that stipulated that if the teacher got married, she would have to quit teaching. And an interesting aside is that as late as 1938, the American Federation of Teachers was fighting for married women to be able to keep their jobs. They ran a blurb in the Silver State Post that notes that capable and experienced teachers should be arbitrarily dismissed because they ask the joys and sorrows of wedded life is manifestly unjust. We hope to see the married schoolma'ams win out. An attorney general's opinion finally ruled that it was illegal to bar married women from teaching, but in 1920, when Fanny was teaching school, there were no such protections. So it's really surprising that the board hired Fanny. It could be that that school district was so desperate for teachers that they decided to ignore the little tradition. In fact, the Superintendent of Public Instruction's report for the previous biennium indicates that there was a desperation for qualified teachers all around Montana. The report stated the number of teachers has not kept pace with the enrollment, so that hundreds of children are deprived of any school. In November 1918, there were still 165 schools that were not supplied with teachers, end quote. So maybe Fanny was hired out of desperation, but whatever the reason, she started teaching at Swift School and moved into the teacher shack right across the road. And that's probably it, although it is possible that that's a different school that she taught at. The school and the students who attended there make up the single biggest topic in Fanny's diary, which she began keeping on January 1st of 1921. She loved teaching, writing on January 10th, "How shall I thank the God above for such expression of his love as to let me use my education in such a pleasant occupation?" And she wrote flourishes under such pleasant and occupation. But though she found the work rewarding, it sometimes discouraged her. She wrote, "Sleep last night was all in vain, for words and sums ran through my brain. I think I tried too hard to teach. Perhaps my aim is too high to reach." Fanny's aim was indeed high. 15 students attended Swift School that winter, and 20 came in the spring when the weather permitted. Fanny truly wished to improve their lives. She introduced a system of teaching that involved engaging the students' interests. She felt that if students were interested enough in their studies, they would not need rules. And after 6 months of teaching, she reflected, "My system was apparently new. Their way I could never allow." For surface work was all they'd do. To reason, they had never learned how. But now the interest they are showing shows me their minds are growing, and the oft-time questions they ask reveal the fruits of my daily task. In addition to engaging her students' interests and growing their minds, Fanny was deeply concerned about their moral education. When she caught someone using foul language during recess, she gave them a forcible lecture on the evils of vulgarity. She commented in her diary, "When I have to make a rule against vulgarity in school, which only lately did appear, the work of Satan's very clear." A few days later, she lectured the students again. "I had to talk and bring to mind to the pupils today in school of vulgarity and evils of its kind, and remind them of our rule. Though this is bad enough, I know, they could greater misdemeanors show. This evil could, without a doubt, with parents' aid, soon be stamped out. But from all that I can gather, it is encouraged, or fostered rather. Wherever then my lot is cast, I'll fight this evil to the last." But to Fanny, vulgarity was only a symptom of the true nemesis that she felt jeopardized her students' moral education. And I am missing a slide. There it is. She strongly opposed the playing of cards in their homes, feeling that it corrupted their young minds. She referred to cards as an opposing influence. In fact, Fanny so despised cards that when she visited a student's parents and found them sitting down to play cards, she walked right out. The evening left her so flustered that for once she didn't even write about it in verse. She wrote, "Walked a mile this evening to a neighbor's, patrons of my school, have 7 neglected, untrained children live in a miserable shack, supper just over as I arrived. The table was ordered cleared immediately, and all, 3 men and the mother, sat down to play cards, leaving the dishes unwashed. I took leave, no regrets and no one to show me out." Fanny didn't object to cards on moral grounds alone. She also felt that they distracted her pupils' attention from schoolwork. After a particularly difficult day at school, she wrote, "Those hateful cards come in my way, the parents not unwilling, and hinder progress through the day by evening hours with folly filling. Oh, what's the use for me to toil and pray when parents seem to pull the other way?" Fanny's efforts to engage her students' interests and keep them on a straight and narrow path often left her exhausted. She frequently wrote things like, "Oh, I am too tired to write tonight, too tired to do anything quite right. Last night I burned the midnight oil, and nothing stopped me from my toil, until done with lessons all outlined, all the things I had in mind." But Fanny drew strength from her deeply held religious convictions. She wrote, "The joy of doing a work of worth is one great pleasure found on earth." A work of worth for Fanny had religious implications. In fact, Fanny saw her mission as to preach and teach in all the world and keep the banner of Christ unfurled. She viewed the school as her own private mission field. But while her religious beliefs led her to rail against the wickedness of cards, Fanny also had a deep concern for the difficulties of farmers. The year that Fanny kept her diary, 1921, marked another year of ongoing drought on the northern plains. It had affected the northern plains as a whole since 1917, and locally on the prairie surrounding Goldstone, the mild winter of 1920 to 21 had dropped very little snow, but then a late spring meant cold weather through May, even though there was very little rain. Fanny agonized over the ways that the drought and the resulting poverty was affecting her students. She wrote, "Childhood was never meant in such a land as this to be spent. Of grown-ups, too, I have my doubts if they were meant to settle hereabouts. Since grass has value dry and green, not but herds of cattle should be seen. 'Twas a mistake, it now appears, for people to make this a home of theirs." Fanny was right to be concerned. Even if a family could get a crop, the price of wheat in 1921 made it difficult to afford even necessities. As Fanny noted in her diary, 3 bushels of wheat makes a weight of flour priced at from 6 to 8. But bushels of wheat sell for $1 each. The money they bring fails to reach. A few days later, she added, "Bare necessities is all there is on hand, and these are grudgingly doled to those to whom they're sold, unless for cash in hand, a very scarce item in this land." Fanny captured the homesteader's dilemma in this poem written on February 10th. "The wind goes tearing by and lifts and tosses dust on high, but it is never cold at all, but just as if 'twere early fall. These settlers all must feel relief. This saves them from lots of grief. Years of failure count up to 4. The wolf is howling at the door. Many have left and gone away. Some saw nothing better than to stay. On hope they live from day to day, hope of prosperity coming this way." Notice how the predicament of the farmers is hidden in Fanny's words. They're happy about the warm weather because it saves them from hardship, but that same weather brings no moisture, which they desperately need. And so they continue to hope for prosperity in one form or another, if not from good crops, then from oil. As Fanny wrote a week later, "The average crops in the last few years keeps everyone in strict arrears. Some say that oil for sure abounds, just waiting to be disclosed, that the wealth beneath these grounds would redeem these farms foreclosed." And so farmers continued to struggle on, living on hope that conditions would improve. A late March snowstorm lifted everyone's spirits, and by April, farmers were in the field. Fanny wrote, "Today the farmers are working away. Seeding is the order of the day. They work with feverish haste for fear this moisture goes to waste." And then, at the beginning of May, disaster struck. She wrote, "Yesterday eve the news went round that cutworms now infest the ground. Thus one dread upon the mind is fully warranted by this find. The prospect now for reaping spells failure wide and sweeping." Cutworms are not really worms. They're moth larvae, and they hide under the dirt during the day and come out at night to feed on the first plant matter that they bump into, in this case, the sprouting wheat. They chew into the stem and cut it down, and because they will often only eat a little bit of the plant before moving on to the next plant, they can destroy a crop. Of the farmers, Fanny wrote, "Farmers work in a half-hearted way, not knowing what to do or say." By May 17th, she wrote, "Farmers are sowing no more seed, fearing they only cutworms feed." The infestation caused at least one family to wash out, and Fanny recorded the tragedy in her diary. "Soon Mr. Walker goes with family of 8 to try his fortune in another state. Faithfully he worked to sow the seeds, hoping thereby to supply their needs. Now his fields are bald and bare, the work of the cutworm showing there." Fanny herself had no ambition to farm. She had taken out her homestead for other reasons. As she confessed in her diary, her goal was to own a ranch on the Milk River. "The desire within my heart is great to continue my contest begun and own a ranch within this state through which Milk River will daily run. A constant picture's in my mind of benefits my ranch might be. Then I have been permitted to see. The river is the pleasure seeker's goal and of all of like proclivities. So on my ranch I'd play the role of director of their activities. So besides the cattle and horses too, my dream of profit and pleasure might even then come true, with benefits to others thrown into the measure. Notice Fanny's word choices. She wants to be director of activities. It is her own dream of profit and pleasure that she pursues. She wants to own the ranch herself. Fanny saw her homestead as a place of independence, where she could enjoy her own decision-making power. In this sense, Fanny's diary fits into a genre of writing by women homesteaders that emerged during the 1910s and 1920s. Women writers published stories in such national magazines as Atlantic, Sunset, and Outlook, celebrating themes of female independence on the homestead. This literary movement, in turn, was part of a larger shift in women's roles. It was a time when, as historian D. Garceau puts it, the brash, kinetic flapper replaced the Victorian matron as a symbol of womanhood. Fanny may not have been aware of her place in this movement, but her diary certainly celebrates her love of independence. She wrote the following poem entitled Coyotes later in the fall. When even comes and daylight fades, they begin their nightly serenades. These rocky caves is a happy home from which at night the coyotes come. If round the coulee curves you've been, if ever the river breaks you've seen, you'll think this way with me, that they belong to the scenery. I rather like their mournful wail. When borne to me upon the gale, they remind me of a life that's wild and free, and that's the kind of life for me. Notice the imagery she chooses. The untamed landscape of the river breaks, the gale, a coyote itself, a wild animal, and then her assertion that she desires the same kind of wild and free life. Poems like this place Fanny directly into the movement of women writing about the homestead experience as a vehicle to independence. Now, for women in the West, independence had different meanings. For some women homesteaders, it meant financial independence, and they achieved it by proving up on their land and then selling it. Investment in land could yield more cash than most occupations open to women at the time. And that includes teaching, which in a rural Montana school in 1921 could bring between $600 and $900 a year. Many women proved up on homesteads for the sole purpose of selling the land and then pocketing the money. An example is Mina Westby, a Norwegian immigrant who claimed land in North Dakota. Mina filed her claim at the Minot Land Office in August 1903, built a shack on her claim, and lived there until December. She then returned to Minneapolis, where she worked as a seamstress to, quote, earn a living. And then she returned to her homestead in mid-March 1904 and stayed there until she had fulfilled the 6-month residency requirement. That fall, she filed the paperwork for a final proof, and after a hitch as the land office decided to investigate whether or not she was a real settler, Mina paid the fee for $1.25 per acre to receive the title, and then she put the land up for sale. In 1908, the land sold for $1,000, and so the money that women like Mina earned from the sale of their land would make for a tidy nest egg. For other women, independence meant economic viability as a family unit. And these women claimed land to increase their family's holdings. In the arid land on which Fanny and John and their family settled, 320 acres wasn't enough to support a farm or a ranch. And so families that would settle in the arid West would work around the law by having eligible family members each file for a homestead, and then they would get adjacent claims and accumulate enough land to support the family. Many single women would claim land and then marry, combining their land with the new husbands. Homestead laws were complicated, and it was a little tricky because if you filed a homestead as a single woman and then got married, you were supposed to forfeit your homestead if your husband had already claimed one. But it was doable. For example, a woman named Josephine Goldman used that strategy in 1918 when homesteader McKee Anderson proposed marriage to her. He also proposed that she take out a homestead. She filed on a piece of land and went straight from the land office to the judge to get married. In their case, the bank was foreclosing on McKee, so he was losing his land anyway, and they were able to keep her homestead. But while Fanny was certainly seeking financial stability, her diary indicates that she had another motive for filing her claim. And this brings up a third meaning of independence to homestead women, decision-making power. Only a head of household could file a claim. A certain social status came along with that, control of a piece of property. Fanny's diary indicates that she chose her homestead and her career deliberately in order to maintain control over her own life. She describes her reasoning in this poem, written on January 4th, 1921. This teaching suits me best, combined with freedom of the West. This rural teaching gives me zest, for here I do whatever I think is best. This little kingdom all my own, and I may choose the seed that's sown. In the towns I fear I may have to do as others say. Though I might see the plan was poor, I could not use my own, I'm sure. Again, Fanny's word choice is striking. Freedom of the West, whatever I think is best, little kingdom all my own, and I may choose. We begin to see a picture of a woman who is tired of being told what to do. So she chooses a career that gives her the authority and develops plans for running a ranch. But lest you get the idea that I'm painting a picture of Fanny as a sort of Western new woman, let me remind you that it's impossible to boil people down to stereotypes. As I said earlier, her life defied expectations. She may have wanted to run a ranch, but she also longed to have her family back. Even her husband, who visited her at the school on rare occasions. She wrote about her wish to have him back in this poem entitled Home. I dare to dream of a little home where the children sometimes come. By children, I mean to include grandchildren among the brood. I'd hope, too, that Mr. Connor might call and inquire of the children and all, or that he might even wish to stay and rest from the burdens of the day. Fanny never did get back together with John, but she did pursue her dream of a cohesive family unit. In late March, she enlisted the help of her son, Robert, and his wife, Lizzie, who, as you remember, had claimed the land adjacent to John's. She got them to help her move a shack onto her claim. They had to move it a mile. This, of course, was done to fulfill the residency requirement that a person improve his or her claim with a habitable residence. But Fanny wasn't interested in proving up just so that she could own her own ranch. She wrote, I hope for 3 years to hold the fort, and then Bob may use it in his support. The 3 years, of course, refers to the time it took to prove up. So you can see that after proving up, Fanny expected to let her son use the land. Furthermore, her goal was financial independence for herself, but Fanny lent money to Bob and Lizzie at least 3 times in 1921, including that fall when Bob nearly lost his stock to the bank. Fanny lent him the money, and Bob traveled to Rudyard through the snow on November 8th to pay his loan and save his stock. She got quite frustrated with Bob that winter. When he bought a pig with the money she lent him, she wrote, it seems there's no end of money I need to lend to keep him on his feet and furnish him with meat. But even so, Fanny doesn't fit the mold of the stereotypical new woman. For all her big talk about running her own ranch, she relied on her family to get by, and she had their best interests in mind too. But in other ways, Fanny did assert her independence. You remember that she had dreamed about attending college before she married John. In late May 1921, after asking God for guidance, Fanny decided to go to summer school in Missoula. The school board hired a Mrs. Mills to teach the last 2 weeks of her term, and Fanny departed on June 13th. Conveniently enough, her husband John was going to have her to fix up deeds, and so she was able to ride that far with him. From Havre, she caught the train to Great Falls and stayed with her son Floyd, who was working at a bank there. She finally arrived at Missoula on June 17th, and she loved Missoula. She found the mountains to be beautiful, and she especially enjoyed the trees, which she had missed so much on the prairie. In fact, she had even written a humorous poem about her longing for trees. She called it Montana. Montana is of trees quite bare, the joy of trees we may not share. Such scenery, on the other hand, is not surpassed in any land. For beauty, look toward the setting sun, and then you've only just begun. But you will have to look just so and keep an upward gaze, you know. For now, on looking down, you'll see the earth is bare and brown. Fanny's work at the university proved too taxing for her to take time to write in her diary. For most of the rest of the month, she wrote her poems after the fact as memories of Missoula. She did snatch enough time to note that she had little time to enjoy the beauty of the surrounding countryside, and to note that the library is open till 12. Perhaps the most telling poem that Fanny wrote at this time is an ode to the university's sprinkler system, entitled The Whirling Spray. The blue grass lawn, beautifully gay, owes it all to the whirling spray. 'Tis true there's but one of its kind, many smaller sprays you'll find. On the large front lawn it holds forth, on the large front lawn and all about is where the circular spray holds forth. It throws its moisture and coolness far out, now east, now west, now south, now north. The water comes from Waterworks Hill, enough all their needs to fill. And of course her astonishment is understandable, given the heartbreaking poems she had written earlier about the poverty brought on by the drought on the plains. Summer school ended for Fanny on August 19th, and she wrote that many of the students she had studied with that summer were destined for rural schools all around Montana. Fanny herself was regretful to leave. She had found Missoula so beautiful and pleasant. But she returned to Goldstone. She traveled through Butte, stopped and visited her daughter Ruby, who by this time had graduated from Dillon and was working as a nurse at Butte's Deaconess Hospital. On September 5th, Fanny started a new term at Swift School, this time with only 12 students. And this photo is actually taken at a different school, but it shows Fanny in the classroom with her students. I think it was probably taken a couple of years later. You can see the president's portrait is up on the wall above Fanny's head, but I can't quite tell which president it is to be able to date the photo. So anyway, one of Fanny's greatest pleasures was to walk along the Milk River. She loved the trees that grew there, the only trees for miles around. She wrote, I felt as I walked by the river's side that from the world I'd like to hide. I'd live where the purling waters flow, where leaves and things make out to grow. It was while walking along the river that Fanny found a place to build her home. I found the very spot of ground where I'd like to make my home. My place should back into the hill and have an eastern view. One way the prairie view should fill, one way the river's winding way show too. I'd love the hermit's life to live, earth's so-called pleasures, all for it I'd give. Within a month of choosing her building site, Fanny bought a house and had it moved to the homestead. It took 2 days to move the house, and Fanny worried about the difficulty of the work, commenting, where hardships come so thick and fast, they make men of iron cast. In spite of having moved a home to her claim, Fanny continued to live across from the school. Her house on the claim needed work, and she hired a carpenter to finish it. Unfortunately, the day after she hired him, the weather turned. Rain began falling, and it turned to snow overnight. She wanted to move out of the teacherage. My home here is not the best, as a rule. Home sweet home was not written of a school. I hope to have a home ere this, but something always seems to be amiss. But she was unable to move into her house on the claim that year. In fact, she never lived on her claim long term, and she never established a ranch there. She finally proved up in June of 1926. In the meantime, she taught at various rural schools around Montana, 8 Point School near Glasgow, Skull Creek School near Watkins, and Abbott School near Valier. When she went away to teach school, she would allow family members to stay in her house on the homestead, and in 1929, she hosted a reunion there. And there she is at the reunion. Fanny died on January 5th, 1931, in Stanley, North Dakota. She had a stroke while on a train passing through on her way to visit her daughter. So what can we learn from Fanny and her diary? First, women homesteaders don't fit into easy stereotypes that are so tempting to historians. Fanny's age and marital status set her apart from an average homesteader, and she doesn't fit the mold of the stereotypical new woman either. And second, reminiscences of the homestead era are often softened by the lens of time, so that fonder memories gloss over the difficulties. Through the immediacy of Fanny's diary entries, we can experience the full spectrum of homestead life, and get a close-up view of the good times and the difficulties of life on the plains. I hope you have enjoyed that view through Fanny's eyes. Thanks. Yes.
You accidentally showed a slide with her writings on it?
Oh, yeah, you want me to bring that back up? I shouldn't have closed it. Oh, let's see. Are there any questions?
So, I want to ask you a question. Would you repeat the question?
Absolutely. Okay. Well, if I can find this. Any questions while I'm looking for this?
Is her diary published?
It is not published. It was donated to the Historical Society about 2 years ago, and the archivist who was in charge of the donation came running up to me. He was so excited about this diary that he photocopied the entire thing and said, "Here, you have to do research on this woman." And so I did. It's, if you want to see it, you can ask in the research center.
How far was her homestead from the old summer school?
Her homestead was just a couple miles away from the school, so definitely within horseback distance. Here we go.
Nice handwriting.
She had beautiful handwriting.
They taught it in those days.
Yes, they did teach it in those days.
So, Christy, is there anything that indicates why she decided to do it in verse?
So the question is there anything that indicates why she decided to write the diary in verse? And she never explained that decision. She just abruptly started keeping the diary, and then abruptly at the end of 1921, the diary stops. You can see the format of the diary here. There's a page for every day. And so she would write one poem every day. And the book ended on December 31st, 1921, and that's when she stopped writing.
Do you think
Yes.
they let her be a teacher as a married woman because she was older and her family was all?
So the question is, do I think that she was allowed to be a teacher because she was older and her family was gone? And that's very possible because school boards were concerned that if a young single woman got married, then she would start giving all her attention to her husband or her children and wouldn't have enough left over for the school children. So since Fanny was on her own, they probably took that into consideration. Other questions?
Did she ever write other poems? I mean, did she continue to write in 1921, or was that just it?
The question is, did she continue to write, or did she ever write any other poems? And the answer is no. As far as I know, she never wrote another poem in her entire life. Any other information we have about her comes from family letters. Did you have a question?
Children still survivors?
The question is, are any of her children still survivors? And actually, no, but the person who donated the diary was her granddaughter. Or, I'm sorry, yes, granddaughter.
Did you have, she does have nice handwriting, but I think I would have gone blind trying to, to get it. Did you have days when your eyes were sore?
The question is, was it hard to read the diary? Did I have days when my eyes were sore? And yes. Sometimes it was helpful to have a magnifying glass. Sometimes she would try to squeeze too much onto one line, and so you just had to sort of decipher it.
How many pages was it?
One page for every day of the year, so 365.
Is this blown up, or is that the size of the page was?
Well, that's blown up. But, yeah, it's blown up.
Do you have any sense if she did any scribbling on scratch paper, or if she just, so with her one day entry, if she practiced, or?
The question is, do I know or have any sense of if she ever scribbled something out on scratch paper before she wrote it into the book? And I'm not really sure. There are very few times when she crosses out words or rewrites things, so I'm guessing she must have scribbled it down first. But on the other hand, she's a very frugal person, and it strikes me that she might have seen that as wasting paper, so I'm not sure.
Are there any other writings by her that you've encountered?
The question is if there's other writings by Fanny. The only other things that I know of that she's written are letters, family letters.
And have you seen those?
Yeah, I've seen a couple. Her granddaughter has more, but she sent me photocopies of several of them.
Well, during your talk, you would say, she wrote a poem about this. Was that included in the diary, or, so she didn't provide anything outside of that?
That's right. The question is, when I mentioned in the talk that she would write a poem about such and such, all those poems were in the diary. There were no poems outside of the diary that I know of.
Would it be possible to get old class rolls and see if any of her students wrote anything about her?
That's a great question, actually. The question is it possible to get the old class rolls and see if her students wrote anything about her? When I gave this presentation at the Montana History Conference in September, a guy in the audience raised his hand and piped up and said, "My father was one of her students." How amazing. And he actually pointed me to a couple more photos of Fanny that you saw in the slideshow.
How long did her husband live?
Her husband died just a couple of years before she did.
He was a tough-looking old bird, wasn't
He was indeed a tough-looking old bird. I think you had to be tough to survive out there on the prairie.
Well, that was great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.